It's a battle for attention. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that it is important to remind the world that the Russian aggression in Ukraine is far from over. Since February 2022, remember, Ukraine has been putting up a pretty tough stand against the Russian aggression, launching a counteroffensive in spring this year. Well, President Volodymyr Zelensky has acknowledged that the counteroffensive has failed to produce the desired results due to the enduring shortages of weapons and ground forces. He has said that it is still important to be back in Ukraine. Now, Russia says that it has upped its offensive as its troops have been advancing in every section of the Ukrainian front. The latest major flashpoint is the industrial town of Avdiivka, where Ukraine has said that it is fending off assaults.
Группировки российских войск наносят ВСУ эффективное и мощное огневое поражение. В результате их боевые возможности значительно снижены. Наши военнослужащие действуют грамотно и решительно, занимая более выгодное положение, расширяют зоны контроля на всех направлениях.
In the eastern Donetsk region, 3 towns have come under simultaneous Russian strikes, killing 1 person while several more are said to be missing. The industrial region has also seen some of the fiercest fighting, with the Kremlin claiming to have annexed it last year. Ukrainian forces also say that it has downed at least about 18 of the 25 Shahed attack drones and one of the 2 Kh-59 cruise missiles launched by Russia overnight. The missiles were fired from planes flying over the occupied Kherson Oblast. The main direction of the attack has been Ukraine's south and east. So with winter set to cloak the wartime, Ukraine once again bringing in new problems for the besieged nation, Zelensky travelled to the front line to boost the morale amongst his forces, vowing not to back down despite the setback. He met with the commanders in the south and the east, and he's urged them to quickly fortify the defences across the front lines.
Those who are giving their lives for Ukraine, I wish you victory. Stay strong. Don't lose initiative. Defend Kharkiv region. Defend Kupiansk. I know that every day you are losing people that are close to you, your combatants. We all understand this is the highest price to pay.
The White House has said that the United States is helping prepare Ukraine for the expected Russia winter attack. It also fears that Russia will try to destroy Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure. The NATO-Ukraine Council, in fact, met for the very first time at the level of foreign ministers earlier in the week. And the members remain steadfast in their commitment to further step up unprecedented military, financial and humanitarian support to Ukraine, and also to support the necessary reforms on Ukraine's path to NATO membership.
So this week we had a ministerial meeting, NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, and the clear message from all the allies was that we will continue to support Ukraine because we have to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, defending their territory, their country. So it will be a big tragedy for the Ukrainians if President Putin wins.
And also to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening in the Ukraine war, we're being joined by Mr. Joachim Bitterlich, who's a former German ambassador to NATO and also a former European diplomatic and security advisor to the former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and he's joining us live on this broadcast from Berlin. Now, Mr. Bitterlich, this of course is a critical moment. The winter is about to set in, and it appears that the Russians are planning a pretty big winter offensive. But the attention of Ukraine's allies, particularly the United States, does not seem focused on Ukraine, but it is divided between both Gaza and Ukraine. What do you think is expected to happen in this stretch of the next 3-4 months along the Ukrainian front lines?
First of all, I'm convinced the recent meeting of NATO foreign ministers had especially one purpose, reassure Ukraine that the Western world is standing with them and continuing to support them. This was the clear message of NATO ministers. Clearly, background Gaza, it's clear. But there was a clear common view of the Europeans in NATO with regard to the Ukraine. There's no problem. Second, the war is developing, let's call it like the First World War in 1916, 1917. There are less poor offensive steps. The war is rather defensive. The Russians have become better in the last months, yes. They have changed their strategy. They have changed their approach. And it's, let's say, actually it's to some extent, let's call it match nil. There are no more clear Ukrainian advances, and Russian advances or defensive advances are limited.
Right.
Therefore, the winter will be, as always in that region, a difficult one. And don't forget, World War II, this is the last experience to this regard. The Germans have lost the war in winter in Russia. Ukraine is not far away from that.
Right.
It's southern, okay, but they lost it too. And it's difficult to fight against Russians in winter. And it will be a much more defensive mood in the winter period than in the past 6 months.
Right.
I think Zelensky has announced that, let's say, this certain change in his last speech. It's clear. It will be a difficult period for the Ukrainians, but I don't see, let's say, the Russians now in winter winning that war. I don't see this.
All right, that's an interesting statement to make, that you don't see the Russians winning even if they carry out a winter offensive. But what do you say for the critics who are saying that the West has in fact lost its appetite to back the Ukrainians in this war, because the spring counteroffensive, the much-touted spring counteroffensive, in which the West, particularly the United States, pumped in weapons and other resources, has failed to produce any kind of concrete results?
But please be aware that there is, and it's normal after a certain period in a war, there is a certain fatigue in the populations, and people are beginning to reflect. I yesterday discussed with some people here in Berlin, let's say, the perspectives to come back potentially, let's say, to one of, let's call it, the intermediate solutions of a ceasefire and of, let's say, ending that war. With, let's say, a specific statute for the eastern of Ukraine, a specific statute for the Crimea, and then let's look at this subject some years later again. But I don't think the time is ripe for this. And the last signals I've heard here in Berlin, and yesterday morning I listened to German Defense Minister Pistorius, who was clear, engaged. We will continue to support Ukraine.
All
and
right.
we double our support this year. And by the way, if you take what the European nations do together, and if you integrate there not only the pure military aid, if you integrate there the humanitarian, the refugees, etc., and the economic aid especially,
Right.
the Europeans at the end of the day do more than the Americans.
All right. I think that's
all
an
the world-
interesting perspective. I think that's an
And you-
interesting perspective, but it remains to be seen, how much backing the Ukrainians, of course, get. Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us with that perspective.
As always, a pleasure.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.